think we all join in knowing that there is no family in this country that has represented commitment to our country and patriotism and pride in the United States of America and in the empowerment of every individual in this democracy. No family more than the Kennedy family. No person has been a greater mentor to me than my dear friend. Please welcome Bobby Kennedy.
Country in northeastern Pennsylvania. This town was so critical to my uncle in 1960. The delegation that was sent from Scranton actually went to the Los Angeles convention, and I was at that convention as a little boy. But they went there committed to John Kennedy, whereas the rest of the state, Governor Lawrence and the rest of the state went committed to Adlai Stevenson. And it was the people from Scranton, the delegates from Scranton, that pulled Governor Lawrence back into the Kennedy camp. And then my father, of course, came here in 1964 at a time when he was morally shattered by the death of his brother, when he was considering withdrawing from public life, and instead, and because of the reception he got with 2,000 people at the Friendly Sons, Lackawanna Friendly Sons, and the reception he got all over the county, it pulled him back into public life, and a few months later he made the decision to run for United States Senate in New York because he believed that he could make an impact because of the experience that he'd had here. And I want to talk for a second, because I've been thinking a lot about my family and been reminded of my family constantly since I got here, of probably the instance that represents my most poignant memory of my father, which happened after his death, in the days after his death, when we brought him back from Los Angeles and we waked him at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and then we brought him from Penn Station in New York to Union Station in Washington, D.C. And it should have been a 2.5-hour trip, but it was a 7.5-hour trip because there were 1 million people on the train tracks. And I was on that train, and it was an extraordinary ride because on that train were people who would have been part of probably what would have been the most progressive government in American history. And outside that train was a cross-section of the American people that I'd come to know from when I was a little boy campaigning first in my uncle's election and all the elections after that. But there were black people, and there were white people, and there were rabbis and priests and a lot of nuns, and there were people in military uniforms, and there were hippies and tie-dyed t-shirts, and every kind of American, and they were holding signs, many of them that said "Goodbye Bobby" or "Pray for us Bobby" or "Goodbye Kennedy." And many of them were carrying American flags. And we brought my father down we arrived late at night at Union Station, and President Johnson picked us up and drove us in a convoy past the mall and the White House. And on the mall, one of the last things that my father had done with Marion Wright Edelman and Ralph Abernathy is they had organized with Martin Luther King the Poor People's Campaign, where they had tens of thousands of impoverished people come to Washington, D.C. and camp out on the mall. And after King's death, Abernathy and Marion Wright Edelman took that campaign over, and those men were on the mall in these little shanties they'd made of plastic bags, and they came, when we drove past them in the convoy, they came to the sidewalk and they put their hats at their chests and they bowed their heads and they stood there quietly as we drove my father up over the Potomac River and then up into Arlington Cemetery and buried him next to his brother up in Arlington. And I remember 4 years later, I was in college and I was studying American history and politics, and I came across polls that were done in the 1972 election and saw that the demographic, those white people who had been standing on that track north of Baltimore, in Maryland and in New York, in New Jersey, at the majority of those people during the 72 election had supported not George McGovern, who was kind of the heir to my father's values, but instead George Wallace, who was diametrically opposed to everything that my father believed in. And it occurred to me then, and it struck me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a dark side and a lighter side. And that the easiest thing for a political leader to do is to appeal to our bigotry, to our hatred, to our greed, to our self-interest, to our xenophobia, to our insecurities, and to our fear. And that the thing that my father had tried to do, and he wasn't alone, there are many other politicians, and one of them is Katie McGinty, is to appeal to the other side of us, to what Abraham Lincoln called our better angels, to get us to transcend our narrow self-interest and to act on behalf of the community and try to bring people together and allow them to feel that the safety, that they can make sacrifices for the entire group and that they won't be taken advantage of. And what you see the Tea Party doing today is, and what Fox News is doing, and what the Koch brothers are doing, and hate radio and Rush Limbaugh, is really a campaign to divide the American people and to tell us that these people aren't really Americans, whether they're gay or whether they're immigrants, whether they're blacks or whether they're women, that they don't deserve to share in the pie. They don't deserve to be part of this country, that they're an other, and that they're not the real Americans. And we see the outcome of that, you know, with this insanity that's going on in Nevada this week and with the murders in Kansas, that these people have been hyped up by our political leaders, by the right-wing political leaders, to believe that they can shoot at federal officials or that they can shoot and kill other Americans because they're not really American, and to divide us in that way. And you know, and one of the big dividing zones is the environment. And the reason the Koch brothers are giving these people money, these hate-filled people money, to further divide us is not because they love America. The reason they gave $200 million during the last campaign and have already given $39 million of their own money. And you know what Charles Koch said? Charles Koch said, I just want what's mine. And that's all of it. And that's what they believe about this country. They believe they're the richest people together, they're the richest people in this country. They want to keep their money and accumulate all of it, and they don't care what happens to the rest of us. And they're willing to use that money in a very strategic way to divide Americans from each other. And why? Because they don't want environmental regulation and they don't want taxes. And that's what divides them. And Katie McGinty, who I've worked with for 25 years, I've known her from when she worked as chief of staff for Al Gore, and I knew her when she worked with her side by side, shoulder to shoulder, when she was in the White House and on many issues when she was here at DEP. She understands that the reason that we're protecting the environment is not so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds, but for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children and provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us. And if we want to do that, we've got to preserve our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the commons, the commonwealth, the public trust assets, the shared resources of our society, air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands, the rivers and the public landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. And one of the things that Katie has argued for many, many years is that, and you hear this, you know, this mantra of the Koch brothers and their sock puppets in Congress and their indentured servants in Capitol Hill and the state capitals, and Governor Corbett, who I include in that group, which is, you know, this false statement that we have to choose between environmental protection on the one hand and economic prosperity on the other. That is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. And this is something Katie taught me. And that means that we need to measure our economy. This is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generation, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. But that's not what the Koch brothers want. What they want, and what all their little, you know, toadies want, is for us to believe that in order to survive, we have to treat the state of Pennsylvania as if it were a business. that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay for. And we can create a few billionaires and enrich them by impoverishing the rest of us. And that, of course, is the Koch plan for the United States of America, and it's the Corbett plan for the state of Pennsylvania. Create a few billionaires by impoverishing the rest of them. And what we, this choice that Governor Corbett made, which was to exempt the shale companies from paying an extraction tax, which every other state except for Texas does that. It says you got to pay a tax if you can extract something from the ground in our state. He exempted it. He gave him $5 million in cash for his campaign. He gave them $1 billion worth of value with that exemption. And where did he get it from? Because it had to come from somewhere. He got it from the education budget. He stole it from the middle class in order to give it to the richest industry in the history of the world. Okay, and that's what the Republican Party is about. It's about creating this plutocracy, this corporate kleptocracy. And this is not free market capitalism. They pretend that they like free markets, but they hate free market capitalism. What they want is corporate crony capitalism. Capitalism for the poor, and a ruthless, savage capitalism for the poor, and socialism for the rich. These welfare oil companies that are taking our money and robbing our middle class and getting a big, cushy subsidy for themselves. They're the most highly subsidized industry in the history of the world. They're getting hundreds of billions of dollars in our subsidies every year through oil depletion allowance and all these big loopholes in the tax code. And we are paying for that. And the middle class is getting robbed in this country because of that. And I agree with the Tea Party. Big government is a threat to democracy. And I see that every day with what Obama is doing with the NSA and spying on people and listening to our phone calls. And this is like Big Brother. Yeah, big government is a huge threat to democracy. But the much bigger threat comes from corporate domination of our country. It's a much scarier thing than government domination, because the government belongs to us ultimately, but the corporations, when they own government, it belongs to them. And from the beginning of our national history, our most visionary political leaders have been warning the American people against the domination, against corporate control of our government. Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, said that the United States of America would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy, that we were too big and too vast and our economy was too diverse and powerful. But he warned that our beloved democratic institutions would be subverted by malefactors of great wealth who would steal them from within. Companies like the oil companies. He was particularly talking about Standard Oil at that time, which has broken up, and now it's in Pennsylvania in a million different little guises. And Dwight Eisenhower, another Republican, in his most famous speech ever, warned against the domination of the military-industrial complex. And again, he included the oil industry as part of that complex. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest Republican in the history of our country, the guy who founded the modern Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln said during the height of the Civil War in 1863, "I have the South in front of me, I have the bankers behind me, and for my country, I fear the bankers more." And Franklin Roosevelt said in 1943, he said that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, the essence of fascism. And Mussolini, with an insider's view of that process, agreed with them. Mussolini complained that fascism should not be called fascism, it should be called corporatism, because it was, in his words, the merger of state and corporate power. And that's what we're seeing today in this country, with the Supreme Court saying, we're taking off all limitations of what these guys can do. And I said on this radio show today, here's what the statistics show. And over the past 20 years, in federal elections, the guy with the most money in 94% of the cases has won that election. So they know they can buy our democracy. And this is becoming the government of the money instead of the government of the many. And what we have to understand as Americans is that the domination of business by government is called communism. And the domination of government by business is called fascism. And what our job is to hold big government at bay with our left, with our right hand, big business at bay with our left, and walk that narrow trail in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy. And in order to do that, we need an informed public who can recognize all the milestones of tyranny, and we need an independent press that is willing to speak truth to power. And we are losing both of those things in our country. We've got a press that is now dominated, that takes its cues from Fox News and from talk radio, and we've got a public that increasingly believes this ideology of the Tea Party that if we cut taxes for the rich, that somehow it's going to trickle down and enrich the rest of us. And it really is just creating the kind of aristocracy of money, a corporate kleptocracy, the very thing that our European ancestors fled to this country, and particularly this state of Pennsylvania, which rang the freedom bell, the liberty bell, and revolted against that kind of domination by an aristocracy. And it's time today for Pennsylvanians to ring the liberty bell again, and the way you're going to start doing that is by electing Katie McGinty governor.